for God to you. And God commanded them to be our watch guards. Now, I don't know all the details. I know that I've been taught all the little ins and outs of this. But somewhere along the way when you're born, I think one's assigned to you. And I think they stay with you all the days of your life. And when you get to heaven, you'll get to meet him. And sort of like the program we watch at Christmas time, where the guy wants to jump off the bridge because his life is so bad, and he has a clearance. That's sort of what my angel probably looks like. A little short, dumpy guy that has a hard time keeping up. But Jacob has that kind of experience with God. Have you had those? I mean, you're up on top of the mountain spiritually. I mean, when you get finished with that, you have seen God and you're ready to overcome the world. But then there's a fact of life. Did you know you can't live on top of the mountain? That the battle of God and the work of God is slugged out down in the valley. And Jacob has those valley experiences as well. As he remembers that I have a brother in front of me. And it becomes so difficult for Jacob to take that mountaintop experience and plug it into the valley. Do you have that trouble as well? I know I do. When the guy cuts in front of you, you want to cut him back. When the guy says something to you, you've got to comment stronger and harder than he had. Do you know? Oh, of course not. I keep forgetting. You people don't have any of those problems, do you? See, when I look in the mirror, I see Jacob. I understand Jacob because I am a Jacob. And so when he leaves the mountain and he sees his brother, what does he do? He starts plotting. As Jacob and his family and the servants and the flocks and the herds and travel closer southwest towards Bethel, the messengers move rapidly to Mount Seir. And by the time Jacob reaches the tributary of the Jordan, the messengers return and they say, Esau is coming towards you, and he's got 400 of his men with him. And he begins to fear. And here's the truth. It is amazing how strong the blessing is. No matter how big and wonderful it is, when you have fear in your life, you forget. As Jacob forgot. And all he could think, all he could see, was 400 men coming toward him and a brother that hated his guts. Oh, excuse me. You're not allowed to say guts in church, right? Expecting the worst, Jacob jumped to the conclusion that his brother had come to take vengeance on him because of what he had done some 20 years earlier. And with his faith all crowded out by fear, he is prone to start scheming and trusting in his own resources. And I know that's not you, but that's me. When we walk by faith and not by fear, the enemy seems small. But when we walk by fear and not by faith, the mouse that runs across the room makes us jump on the table and cry out in awe, fear, and trembling. He shall not be afraid of evil tidings. His heart is fixed, trusting in the Lord, David says in Psalm 112, verse 7. But Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, it says. And therefore he reverted back to his old policies, his old scheming. And instead of remembering the encounter and the vision of God's angelic army that was there before him, Jacob divides his camp into two bands. He separates them and says, if he attacks one, the other one can get away. And then you'll see him. In the middle of the night, he sends them all over this little tributary, and it says that he stays on side, alone. And Jacob prays. You know, it's amazing the contrast that you see in this guy. And maybe you see the contrast in yourself as well. But when Jacob prayed, I'm telling you, it was one of the greatest prayers recorded in all of the Word of God. And yet it's prayed by a man who has the most difficulty in keeping his faith intact. He was like the father of that demonized child who cried out, Lord, I believe. Help me to believe even more. Mark chapter 9, verse 1. And every statement in this prayer, I mean every one of them, go back through, and when you get a chance, go back through in verse number 9 and down through about verse number 11 and just underline. I mean, it is the prayer that you're going to want to be able to pray. And every statement in the prayer indicates that Jacob had a profound knowledge of God. He attended Sunday school somewhere. I mean, his mama and his daddy might have been bums at living it out, but they taught him what it was to know God. And he prayed in desperation. Maybe not in confidence, but knowing that God heard him. Very quickly, I want to look at the arguments in his prayer. Verse number 9, you find out he knew all about God's covenant. He knew that God had made a covenant with Abraham, his grandfather, and Isaac, his dad. And now with him, he knew the covenant. How can I be afraid when I know that God is going to make of me a great nation? And those that bless me will be blessed, and those that curse me are going to be cursed. And he knew the covenant of God. And in verse number 9, he knew the command of God. He knew that God had told him that he was always going to be with him. He was going to be protected. And he remembered that. And he told God, I remember your covenant. I remember your command. And in verse number 10, I remember your care. As we reviewed over the last 20 years how that he came into this land with just a staff in his hand. And now he was leading a man of great wealth. And he knew how that God had cared for him and took care of him. And in verse number 11, it talks about God's purpose. That God had a plan. God had a purpose for his life. And finally, in verse number 12, it talks about God's promise. And it's just amazing the theological explanations that you see in his prayer. And then you find when he leaves there, you would think he is ready to take on the world. But remember how difficult it is that when you're on the mountaintop to take that blessing with you when you have to go into the valley. Does anyone relate to this? Or when I look in the mirror, I see Jacob. And you would have thought, when you got finished with verse number 12, that a guy who could pray a prayer like this in this solid theological context that it was, that it would bring peace of God into his life in such a way that he could conquer anything. But in verse number 20, he says, I will pacify him. And he put together all these expensive gifts. And Jacob compromises. He sells out what he knows to be true for what he thinks will make things right. I gotta say this right. I want you to hear it. I wish I could just pour it into your head and make it go down into your heart. Living by faith means that you don't have to scheme. Living by faith means you don't